You're listening to the Whole Church Podcast. Our efforts to educate and unite the church are made possible thanks to our sponsors on Captivate and on Patreon. You can get bonus content of our show on either of those platforms or on Apple Podcasts with a private subscription to the Amazal Ministries Podcast Network. Deuteronomy chapter 14, verses 27 through 29 in the Christian Standard Bible. Do not neglect the Levite within your city gates, since he has no portion or inheritance among you. At the end of every 3 years, bring a tenth of all your produce for that year and store it within your city gates. Then the Levite, who has no portion or inheritance among you, the resident alien, the fatherless, and the widow within your city gates, may come and eat and be satisfied. The Lord your God will bless you in all the work of your hands that you do. In this passage of Scripture, the writer is in the midst of describing 3 different tithes the people of Israel are commanded to pay from their land. The third tithe mentioned is brought up immediately after 2 other tithes are commanded, honoring God, and then one for festivals. This tithe is to help the poor, the immigrants, the Levites, and the needy. Kester Brewin, why do you think God might want his people to collectively prioritize these groups from among themselves the way that it's commanded here?
I mean, I'll be perfectly honest. I don't think it's my total area of expertise doing a exposition on scripture in one way. And I think probably my relationship to the Bible may be different to some of the other listeners. But what I would say is the fundamental thing that has guided me in that journey is the importance of how we relate to the other. And I think that's just so central to everything that is within all of Scripture, but this, obviously in particular. In fact, I wrote a book called Other many years ago, which is literally about exploring that relationship. We're asked, what are the greatest commandments? Love God, love your neighbor as you love yourself. And there are kind of 3 things there, like how do we love the other which is within ourselves, and all of us as kind of fragmented people in some ways, but it is loving that neighbor. And loving those who are different to us. And, sometimes I wonder if it would be better if Christians were like non-self-identifying. Like, you don't ever get to call yourself that. If someone else wants to call you that, then that'd be great. But if people said, that person is a beacon of justice and kindness and humility and creativity. And one of those hallmarks for me would be, that person is someone who has great love and empathy for that person who is other, that person who is kind of excluded or is kind of being exiled in some way. And I think that's just kind of incredibly central to everything that is godly, is that kind of relationship to otherness.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. All right, everybody, welcome to the Whole Church Podcast. Possibly your favorite church unity podcast. Probably not, but it's possible. I am your second favorite co-host. Your favorite co-host, TJ Tiberius Juan Blackwell, is not here. He might be late. Unsure if he shows up or not. We will not hold our breaths because, that might not be wise. But I know you guys will be missing him. But don't worry, we'll make up for it. We have a great author. Kester Brewin is our guest. Our last guest before we go to our series we've been talking about, What's Next? So we figured we'd we'd end the finale to our summer episodes. We're going to just have an episode about pirates and AI and all of those hot topic, fun topics with someone I was just introduced to earlier this year, thanks to Josh Patterson. You also know him, hopefully, if you've been listening to the show. Kester Brewin, welcome to the show, man.
Thank you. So good to be here.
Yeah, it is awesome to have you. I don't want to take too much time because our listeners probably know that I'm like a pirate fanatic, and they're like, oh man, this is just Josh's excuse to nerd out. And you're right, it is. So this will be fun. And we're not just talking pirates. We're going to be talking radical theology, AI, some other stuff like that. So it's like pirates through Christian lens. So we'll get into it. Since TJ's not here, I'll try to do his parts. You guys know I'm not good at that. So, check out the other shows on the Amazal Podcast Ministry Network, the AMP Network stuff. I have another show, Dummy for Theology. We got Systematic Ecology, Let Nothing Move You, all kinds of stuff. Check out those shows. Head over to our store to get some comfy t-shirts, stuff like that represent the show and church unity and whatnot. And now back to stuff I'm used to doing. My favorite form of unity comes in a sacred sacrament of silliness. I don't know if you knew that, but we like to start every show off with a silly question. So, Kester Brewin, I'll answer first. Give you time to think about it. Today's question is just very me-coded. If you had to invite any one fictional pirate to your next Thanksgiving dinner, who would you invite? I'm gonna answer this for TJ as well. TJ will say John Silver from Treasure Planet because he's a chef and he would bring his own dish and it would be amazing. That's what TJ says. What I'm gonna say might shock some people. That you guys know one of my favorite movies is Pirates of the Caribbean. One of my favorite animes is One Piece. And I even thought about saying Hondo from Star Wars. You know, Hondo's cool. But I am gonna go One Piece. I'm not gonna go who you think. I'm not going to go with Luffy. As much as I would get along with him, I simply cannot create enough food for him to eat. It is not possible. So instead, I'm going with Chopper the reindeer from One Piece. He's a doctor, so if something goes awry, you know, he can help heal us up. But most importantly, he also loves food, but not to the extent of Luffy. And me and him have similar personalities, so I think we'd get along and make a lot of fun jokes and have a good time. Kester Brewin, do you have a fictional pirate you would like to invite to your next Thanksgiving meal?
I'm slightly wary of the word fictional here because for many it may be slightly heretical to say that Luke Skywalker is a fictional character, but I hate to break people. Christmas, but also we don't have Thanksgiving over here, so but I'm going to put on a special Thanksgiving dinner if Luke Skywalker will come, and one of the things I unpack in this book about pirate culture, which is called Mutiny, which is a real kind of theological work, actually, genuinely, even though that may seem extraordinary to say that. One of the things I draw on is how Star Wars is really an archetypal pirate movie. It's the rebellion versus the empire, and what is more pirate than that? And it's got all the kind of father-son dynamics going on that lie down under the deep realms of the kind of piratic action and kind of psychoanalysis and stuff. So it'd be kind of fun to have Luke there, and particularly to ask him about his time in the swamp, which is pretty pirate filth, and also that killer shot on the Death Star, which is like that great movie ending pirate shot. So he would be my non-fictional fictional call-in on the dinner.
Oh man, that's a good one.
It's just whether he'd bring his dad. I mean, that's the key question we want to know. Like, is he going to bring his dad? But we'll have to see.
I mean, I hope so. Oh man, that's a good one, and it even sets the stage for broadening what some people might think of when they think of pirate, as we're going to talk here in a little bit about. But first, just some preliminary work. So one thing we found that really helps engender church unity, which is what our show is primarily about, is to hear one another's story. So we were wondering if you could just kind of share some of your faith journey or something about how you've come to what you believe now with us.
Sure, yeah. So I was born into a minister's family. My dad is still a Church of England minister, and there's a kind of long history of that. And in fact, one of my forebears, called Alexander Stewart, was a famous Scottish preacher. And in fact, when he died, they had a 2-minute silence in Edinburgh. He was called the Golden Voice of Scotland. But he wasn't a particularly nice guy. A great preacher, but was much troubled at home, as they said. So yeah, I mean, kind of faith has been right there in my DNA. And then when I, kind of went to college, I was a Billy Graham kid, actually. That was the kind of the real kind of spark moment. Even though I was brought up in a minister's family, I think it was Mission England, 1980. Someone will look it up. 85, something like that. Yeah. Football stadium. Thought I was going down to meet Maradona. Joking. So yeah, I went to college and started to ask a lot of questions, as a lot of people do at that time. But rather than, leave church behind, which a lot of people do at that point, I decided to go kind of deeper and deeper into that, and to allow those questions to really, really get asked, and not to be afraid of some of those answers. And after that, so I was in a big church in London for a long time, and just felt that vehicle wasn't really the place that was kind of giving me and some friends life at the time. A lot of us were kind of artists, writers, dancers, creatives, and so on. So we got permission to use a space in a part of Southeast London, which wasn't massive barn of a church that wasn't used on a Sunday night, and we started a a thing called Vox, which was, just a kind of way to express some of those questions and get into those through what I think now would be called the alternative worship scene. But we were just kind of doing what we felt was right, which was to, explore these deeper questions in a really honest way. And yeah, that kind of led me to a very different place in that, and into this kind of area of what I'd call radical theology, which some people may know about, some people may not know about. But yeah, I mean, I suppose many people would say that the faith that I have now is not kind of truly Christian, but I kind of feel more Christian than I ever in my life. So we'll go figure that out.
Yeah. Well, could you just unpack that just a little bit? Why would people say it's not Christian?
Well, I guess the place that I've come to is that the gospel for me really is a radical understanding of the death of God. And I think that the words that mean the most to me are in that celebration of, what do you want to call it? The Mass, the Eucharist, whatever, where, it says we are the body of Christ. And for me, that rite, that ritual is incredibly profound, because what we are doing is taking seriously the death of God and the crucifixion and the breaking up of that body and that distribution of that body then to each one of us into this kind of network out there, so that we become the body of Christ. In other words, this is taking seriously a faith which does not require a transcendent God, but one which says, actually, the most godly thing we can do is to be the body of Christ ourselves. And, maybe to leave that question of the existence of a transcendent God to one side, because, it's one of these non-answerables that causes people an awful lot of, back and forth and heartache and blah, blah, blah. And I'm saying, well, on the other side of that, this is not about doubt or, kind of whatever. It's like, okay, I'm going to live in this way beyond that question and say, I take seriously the death of God, and I take seriously that gospel message of we are the body of Christ. And I think that's, a profoundly important place. And that, I think, is what, what's often called radical theology, and can become very complicated and all about Hegel and Lacan and psychoanalysis and all this stuff. I'm not, and pyro, this and the other. I'm not really interested. Like, we are the body of Christ. This is it. Like, we do those actions in order to be the most godly people we can be. But taking seriously that kind of, moment of death as a kind of grander thing of, like, in terms of our progression as human beings, to say, look, we keep deferring to this big other, like, this big other out there is going to sort out these problems, all the rest of it. It's like, no. This is about us. This is about our radical responsibility as human beings for climate, for planet, for all of these different areas. And for me, that's that is the most godly place that I can end up in.
So would it be accurate then to say, at least of your belief, I don't know if this would apply to all of radical theology or not, that maybe it's not a denial of a transcendent God, but less of a we don't care, or like they say that with, like, the history of Christ's birth, it's more about the immanent God and Jesus in us rather than the one out there?
Yeah, I mean, some people would say, it's a place of not caring, and I think my worry about that sometimes that it can be an opportunity for people to kind of put that to one side and say, oh my gosh, answering that question would be too traumatic to deal with culturally, in terms of family, in terms of other things, and my view is, well, I have many people who've been in touch saying, look, I kind of want to go down that route of what you're saying, but I've got the church house and the healthcare policy, and the kids are in school and everything, and I can't go there. And there are a lot of people actually out there who are like, I want to be in that place of liberation, but I can't do that. So it's couched in more like, well, let's leave it to one side. So yeah, it is useful to do that in some ways, but for me personally, I'm kind of more in, actually, I've kind of gone beyond that question of particularly worrying about that into, okay, this is just where I'm at as a more kind of steadfast place. Yeah.
No, that makes total sense. for me, myself, I'm kind of like a both and, I do find myself sometimes praying and like looking up to the skies and like asking for help kind of deal. But then a lot of times I know I'll just be on a walk in nature and I'm like, oh, God is in all of this. And in fact, when I go back home and how I treat my family, God is in that. And so I do a little bit of a both and, but I definitely feel like radical theology has been the one challenging me the most recently and how I live out my life. And I don't know, for me personally, I find what challenges me to be the thing that I'm drawn to most rather than the thing I'm most comfortable with. Because I'm comfortable with it. I don't know. It's almost like it's boring,
Yeah.
Just being honest.
Yeah. I'll be honest. I've had a lot of people kind of presenting challenges and saying, hey, we're really uncomfortable with what you're saying. It's like, well, hold on a minute. All I'm doing is trying to take seriously the real questions that I've had rather than, I'm just going to walk away. And really, this is the kind of process of what, a theologian like John Caputo would talk about deconstruction. And there's a kind of composting there. It's about breaking down those materials and seeing what the essence is there and seeing underneath that structure, which is one of the reasons why I left a very, very big structured church, which was a bit like, I suppose, an enormous cruise liner, as in, you can go along and enjoy yourself. You don't really have to do anything or ask any serious questions. Like everything's just provided and we're just kind of going on this journey. And I was like, yeah, I kind of want to experience the sea. I kind of want to be thrown about by the waves a bit and feel the reality of the ocean, I think. And that's an important place to be sometimes. Yeah.
I love that metaphor. And I do also think that, and that's part of what we wanted to talk about your book about, is this mutiny, Why We Love Pirates and How They Can Save Us, actually was one of those books that for me, it was like, because I guess I'm just so familiar with the pirate world, so it lets me kind of understand what you're saying a little bit better. And I was like, oh, okay, I get this. I was able to kind of make a connection here. So hopefully for those either like me or not like me at all, who aren't familiar with radical theology, that maybe this will give you a window into kind of seeing a different part of what I would still consider the church. And we can just kind of walk around that and discuss pirates and the church. So
yeah.
So you wrote this book. First thing, then, I was just kind of curious. Could you, well, actually, you say it in the book, but for our listeners who maybe haven't read the book, could you kind of describe what inspired you to write about pirates in the first place?
Yeah, I mean, as I say in the book, there's this kind of weird period in life where my son kept getting invited to these pirate-themed birthday parties. He's like 7-8 years old. And he wasn't getting invited to any aggravated robbery parties. And I just found that weird. Like, why is this okay to dress a kid up in, pretty violent gear and kind of slashing around and stuff? And yet it's not okay. It wouldn't be okay to kind of go for the other end of this violence. So what is it about pirates, particularly at that childhood moment, that is transformative? And I was spending some time in therapy at the time, dealing with a bunch of stuff. And it just kind of literally came to me at the end of a session. And I kind of ran out of the house and sat in my car and pretty much outlined the whole book there, that I wanted to dig down into what is it about pirates that is so profound, in terms of what are they teaching us about cultural change and about personal change. And I think that that's incredibly important, that pirates, in terms of how they function in our culture, and how they've also functioned, through history, act as catalysts of change. That does not mean that everything they do is wonderful or great, or to be, something that we should be lauding and praising. Absolutely not. But they do some profound work of holding up a light to things that do need changing in our culture. And the more I began to read about them, the more I realized, actually, this history of these pirates as these terrible, violent people has been told by only one side. And actually, if you begin to look at the other side of the real people behind that, there's a much more interesting story there about liberation, I suppose.
Yeah. It's funny because I usually had, I think in most times of my life, if I had come across your book, it would have been easier for me than it would have the time that I did read it, because usually I just love pirates. I read a lot of pirate books. I know a lot of stories are told of like people who were in slavery who ended up becoming pirates because, hey, screw being slaves. And I'm like, yeah, that makes total sense. Or, women whose husbands were accused of piracy, so they had to go out to sea or else be arrested, but simply because they were married to someone who was found guilty, and it's like, yeah, this is terrible situations, and it makes sense. But I happened upon your book right after reading a lot about Bartholomew Roberts, and I've just went through this like deep dive studying and learning about that time when he burns down an entire slave ship. And then I read this book, and Bartholomew Roberts is one of your prime examples, and I'm like, oh, that's right. There is this weird tension here of like, they weren't always like great people. In fact, sometimes they were the worst. And the amount of people he killed and treated like probably was more than Ted Bundy. And yet if we made the same kind of like silly movies of Pirates of the Caribbean, but it was like Ted Bundy, people would not be okay with that.
Yeah, and this is the key thing, is that, if we want to talk about the kind of golden age of piracy, you're dealing with the beginnings of an incredibly aggressive form of capitalism, which is abusing people in all kinds of ways. So we've obviously got the transatlantic slave trade, but then you've also got the people who are kind of being press ganged into working on these merchant vessels, by princes and industrialists, as it were, and they are pushed onto these ships and they are forced into terrible, terrible conditions. I mean, fed absolutely rotten food, given almost no pay at all, and they are just discarded if they are injured, and that happens incredibly commonly. And in fact, the skull and crossbones is simply the symbol that is used in the ship's log for when somebody is killed on that passage, So it is a very, very violent and really, really horrible, horrible place to be on the non-pirate vessels. So when these guys commit that act of rebellion and begin their mutiny, it's not as if they suddenly become totally virtuous, wonderful people. This is what they have been taught to do. They have been taught the skill of raiding other ships. They have been taught, all of these things about how to generate wealth from this horrifically corrupt form of capitalism. Their main crime is that they just don't give the profits to the king anymore. That's why they're labeled pirates. They are not labeled pirates by whoever it is back home because they're doing terrible things. They are labeled pirates because they are not handing over the riches, having been doing the very same things at all. So that's not to valorize them in terms of their behavior, but it is to say that in that moment of liberation, something extraordinary happens to those power relationships, and that sets in motion all kinds of changes around how people understand wealth and property and the relationship to power and aristocracy and, all of those kind of bigger questions. And it's pirates who kind of force through those kind of immediate, very, very pressing questions for people about how they're going to respond to that.
I'm going to try not to get on too many side tangents, but I thought of two things when you were talking about that. And one's more modern day and one's more just pirate stuff. So I'll start with the pirate stuff and go to modern because, people might be more interested. I don't know. The pirate stuff, Henry Morgan's one of my favorites. And I was just kind of thinking of how he was put in this awkward situation where it's like his government's on one side, the church is on another. He has to choose between family members and being an outlaw. And he eventually was just like, you know what? Screw all this. I'm just going to do my own thing. And doing his own thing is what made him a criminal. And you're like, wow, that's very.
And pirates were well known at the time as villains of all nations. They were the ultimate outcasts, and I think there's something incredibly Pauline about that. This is a group of people who are cast out of everybody, and it's that total othering that actually makes them incredibly interesting in terms of what forms out of that, in terms of their own community and their own ways of becoming and relating to the world in terms of what they do once they have been labeled, basically the worst of the worst for everybody.
So, and that goes to the other thing that it made me think of, and I'm trying not to be too American about this. I feel like other countries also have similar issues, but here, a lot of times you'll hear kind of our conservative Republican parties will talk about illegal immigrants, and they will come up with all these different things to call them and show where they're doing all these crimes. But really, the thing that we're actually talking about is they're not paying taxes. They're not giving the money to the government is really what makes people mad.
Yeah, exactly. And, you know, it is that, again, we come back to that othering, that sense of, you know, excluding people for various things. And that is so problematic in terms of how you then treat people. And yet these are people who show us, you know, and I talk about this a lot in my book, they help us to see better ourselves and one another. And that's just kind of profoundly important. And that's one of the things that pirates do as well, is in this kind of radical alterity, is that they really help us to hold a mirror up to who we really are.
Yeah. Because, you know, not just immigrant situations, but also going back to like the pirate times, a lot of times all the polity and kingships and all the stuff is like, we make it so complicated. It's just hard, so difficult for normal people to just kind of function, you know, that it's like, well, what other option do we have? So,
and as you'll know, you know, the term pirate was incredibly fluid. And you would have people who were labeled, you know, perfectly good captains one day, and then they were pirates the next day because the Queen didn't like them, and then they were privateers, and then they were like, you know, so it was a labeling given to you by the authority structures. And you know, one of the radical things that pirates do is to say, okay, we are going to speak of ourselves. You know, we are the dead. And that skull and crossbones, you know, raising that flag is them saying, you consider us to be the worst of the worst, and we will take that. We are your utter horror. We are the dead. And there is, again, something profoundly Christian about that, about, you know, we are the dead. We are the ones who talk of resurrection. We are the ones who are kind of, you know, after this kind of casting into the death place, as it were. And that is incredibly important in the way that they are responding to a culture that is oppressing them so hard.
Oh yeah. Last side tangent. Captain Kidd, I feel like, is the best example for me, because it was like he didn't even have a choice. Like his crew decided to mutiny, and he was like, "Wait, I'm just here." And by virtue of being there, he's a pirate and gets hung out so publicly for everyone to see. This is what happens to pirates. And the dude didn't even try to break the law. Like he wasn't even trying to be a pirate, and he's like one of the most notorious pirates. You're like, what?
Yeah.
What exactly did he do though?
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Man, yeah. So. Yeah, sorry, I'm just such a pirate geek. But one of the things that was cool about your book is you didn't just do like all these like golden age classic pirates. You used all kinds of different examples. You know, I mentioned Bartholomew Roberts. You talk about the somalian pirates. You talk about pirate music, where people are pirating music on the internet. You talk about book pirates at one point. So, as far as like you're concerned, what do you think are some of the most unique examples of pirates that you use?
Yeah, I mean, just to kind of say a little bit more about my writing in general. You know, as I say, this is a theological work, but I'm kind of really interested in story and narrative and helping people to kind of get into ideas without it being purely just, you know, let's look directly at theology, but say, okay, you know, let's have a little look at some of the history stuff. Let's have a look at some of the stories that you already know about and look at them from a different angle. So one of the stories that I unpack in the book, which is, you know, I suppose one of the more unique ones is Wendy from the kind of classic tale of Peter Pan. You know, and Peter Pan's an interesting character. Peter Pan, if your readers know, you know, arrives in this London townhouse late one night and is a boy with no shadow. And anyone who's done any psychotherapy is like, whoa, hold on a minute. No shadow. This is interesting. And the centerpiece of the story is really Wendy, who is a child, but it's her last night in the nursery. And this is the moment where she is going to transition from girl to woman. And yet her parents have gone out. So she's already disempowered in terms of that transition. How is she going to do that? How is she going to move from the nursery into, you know, a kind of proto-adulthood? And Peter Pan turns up and offers her, you know, come to Neverland where you don't ever need to grow up. It's like, whoa, you know, that can feel tempting as a child, like I won't ever need to grow up. So off she goes and meets the Lost Boys and kind of has to perform this weird role as mother. And yet she's not mother. She is a girl. She's on the cusp of womanhood, and yet she's, becoming a mother, and she's in a land where there is no time. Like there can't be anything that can break this. Now, who comes to break that time cycle is, this pirate. And we get the, and then we've got a crocodile who's swallowed this clock or swallowed the wristwatch from the pirate. And so we get this reintroduction of time into the narrative, which I talk about. And of course, the key thing that Wendy needs to do is to slay the pirate in order to be able to get back to her life in London and presumably to progress. Now, in the original telling of the play in the production, the pirate was played by the same character who played her father. And there is this symbolic moment of slaying the parent, which we also see Luke Skywalker doing to Darth Vader. It's the slaying of the parent in order not to kill the parent, but to kind of break that relationship in a kind of faithful way in order that relationship can be restored. And this is a kind of classic pirate move, is to create that kind of breakage, not to destroy the entire thing, but in order to bring some kind of movement and renewal, which is why I also talk about music piracy, because, back in the day in the UK, there was only one radio station, and it played like 20 minutes of light music a day. So what are you going to do with that if you're a young person? So a bunch of pirate DJs, as they were called, get a boat and they station it out in the English Channel and they start broadcasting music. Now, they don't want to destroy the BBC. They want to renew it. And that's exactly what happens. Like the BBC are so threatened and challenged and all the rest of it, these terrible pirate DJs, until, of course, they then go and hire them and start Radio 1, which is like, the big pop station in the UK. So this is this kind of pirate thing. It comes out to slay that kind of higher parental figure, not in order to kill it, but in order to adjust that relationship and to bring that forward in terms of renewal. And of course, there's something incredibly gospel about that too, about that renewal of a relationship that has gone profoundly wrong. And, this kind of idea of piracy is storming heaven, of like storming some great wealth store and returning the riches to the commons, to the common people.
Not to alienate the audience I know we have a lot of audience who are not for alcohol, but if we're talking about pirates, you got to talk about rum at some point.
Yeah.
One of the things I find really interesting too, though, is like that whole narrative. There was I forget what country, but there was European countries who basically paired with the church to say, this alcohol is sin, but whiskey is fine, because whiskey is something we can produce and rum is something we cannot produce.
Yeah.
And it was really like they used the guise of religion to try to juxtapose this, like, you have to use our products to kind of funnel wealth to us.
Yeah.
And it's just so interesting when you compare that to like Jesus's life and what he was doing with the Pharisees and how they were trying to make money off of the religion and pairing with the government.
Yeah.
And you see very much the same thing that Jesus did, where he's turning over the tables and he's saying, hey, actually, this is not what being of God is about. And then you see the pirates going, especially Henry Morgan, I got to go to Henry Morgan. He's creates an entire empire out of just, hey, we're going to get rum to people, because actually there's no reason this shouldn't be commonly available. There's no reason that alcohol in one form is a sin and the other isn't.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's absolutely right. You talk about the turning over the tables in the temple, and that's such an interesting story because it's kind of presented as the cleansing of the temple. And I see it as precisely the opposite. It is the removal of those who were barring the unclean from coming into the place of cleansing. There were barriers being put up by people, which you had to overcome by having, certain coins and certain amounts of wealth. And what Jesus is not doing is cleansing the temple in terms of that, but is actually saying, hey, allow the unclean to come in freely without having to pay that. And that is the kind of proper pirate move. And of course, wasn't Jesus kind of arrested as a criminal? Wasn't he tried as a heretic and all the rest of it? There is such a pirate figure there that you see if you begin to read all the other pirate narratives too, including Odysseus, including all the other ones that you could draw in from history. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Yeah. So I think that I'm trying to get to some of the tension of like we talked about earlier. Bartholomew Roberts, a lot of them did bad things, but it wasn't because they were pirates. Is being a pirate like from your view as like radical theology kind of Christian, is piracy ever just justified?
I think the denomination pirate is extremely complicated, and it is generally given by somebody in power to somebody who is threatening that power. So again, I'm not particularly interested in people who say, well, I'm a pirate and I'm going to go and do pirate things. I'm interested in those who are labeled as pirate, and can we begin to understand why they were doing those particular things? Now, the history of Somali piracy is very complicated, but one of the threads of that right at the beginning is you've got these enormous European trawlers coming in who emptied their fishing, lands, as it were, and left these traditional fishermen with nothing. And they're seeing all of this enormous amount of capital just being shipped through this shipping lane, this tiny place. And they're like, well, where's our bit of that, So in fact, their act of piracy was really a kind of wealth tax, as it were. Now, do I think it was right what they did? I wouldn't say I wanted to defend it. Was it right what the European trawlers did and what people were doing, just kind of, trashing through this ocean and disregarding and, oppressing a bunch of people on the side? That certainly was not right either. So the justification is really about, we need to look at where there are inequalities, where there is, wealth that has been gathered into an enclosure, and whether it is right to break open that enclosure and return that wealth to the commons. Now, that's not an argument for communism. That's an argument for understanding how resources kind of move around in an economy. And, the book I've just written about AI kind of outlines how the great promise of this digital revolution is that it's going to give so much down to us and democratize us, and every single one of us can just kind of, have access to all this extraordinary power. And in fact, the real thing is that flow is entirely the other way, that these tiny number of tech companies are absorbing so much power and wealth and information onto themselves that actually, breaking that open sometimes can be seen as an act of something that is, good to kind of share out, as it were. So these are not simple questions of morality. These are questions of wealth flows and what is appropriate to do when people have kind of gathered so much wealth into one place. Is it ever appropriate to break that open? And you do see those flows happening in economies through history, whether that be around the way that music has worked. I mean, whether it's around the forming of the United States, which was called the original pirate nation for good reason, because your founding fathers said, hold on a minute, we're not going to respect European copyright law. We want people to be educated. So we're going to steal their books and print them so that our farmers and our, people, they have free access to information. That was why America was so reviled by the British and the French, because they were stealing stuff, but they were stealing it for good reason. And when copyright law becomes totally oppressive, is it ever right to break it? That I mentioned story in the book, of a children's book that I bought for my kids, and it said on the inside cover, "This book may not be read aloud." It's like, what the hell are you talking about? I'm breaking copyright law if I read this book aloud to my children. Okay, I'm willing to break that law. I am willing to say that there is a Christian imperative to break that crazy copyright law.
Yeah. It's so interesting how America started for so many things. The stuff that they were upset about with copyright law, or say we, I guess, would be appropriate, or even taxes. And now it's like we do that to ourselves now. So good for us. Anyway. Sorry, I'm not always the most patriotic. Sometimes I can, but not today. So it sounds like you're more for giving a voice to those who feel like they've been betrayed by the system, or giving a voice to the commons, the stuff that's been taken and privatized that should be common, rather than we're not necessarily championing the violence and stuff or any of that kind of. stealing.
Yeah, I mean, and I would go back to when I was talking about what happens in the Mass or in the Eucharist. We are redistributing something that is centralized. And if you think about the kind of symbolism around that moment with the tearing open of the temple, this is about a structure which was centralizing religious power, and that gets broken open. So that, we become the body of Christ, and that kind of, pouring out of the gifts at Pentecost, whatever. Again, that is for me a movement of a returning of things into the commons, into the common life. And I think it can be very, very simplistic to talk about this as some kind of, radical socialism or whatever, those kind of scary words that people want to put in. No, this is gospel economics. This is about understanding the commons in terms of our joint access to resources, and how with different kind of economic flows that get tied into religious narratives, those can be centralized for the good of those who are in charge. And we go through those moments where those need breaking open.
Yeah. All right. I have one more pirate question. Then I want to touch on AI before we wrap this up, because I know that's what you've been doing more recently, some of the AI stuff. But there was one quote in your book that really kind of moved me. It's causing me to really question capitalism at all and my views on radical theology, all kinds of stuff. So I wanted to read this quote and just kind of let you unpack this, or I don't know, contextualize it, if you will. So this is from your book, Mutiny. The quote is, "This, then, is what we can take pirate to mean. One who emerges to defend the commons wherever homes, cultures, or economics become blocked by the rich. Pirates can be understood in the terms of a critique against individualism. We live in a privatized culture where people privatize everything for private use. Pirates break the chains of privatization in an effort to restore the commons." So, yeah, that's kind of what you've been talking about. Do you want to contextualize that or break that down a little bit further? Or?
Yeah, I mean, the nature of property and private use is kind of so interesting, and a kind of privatized religion and a kind of individualized thing. And pirates kind of work against that in very, very interesting ways. And again, I would just kind of want to emphasize that idea of returning things to the commons. There's something very profound and important about that. And I think, a great American essayist, someone like Lewis Hyde, who wrote a book called Common as Air, which is all about ideas of early copyright and stuff like that. Those things were there to protect innovation rather than to keep wrapping things into people's wealth. So you get these kind of crazy things where people are just kind of, putting trademarks and copyrights and stuff that they haven't even got just in case somebody breaks them, and it as a means of wealth creation. Whereas the original idea of copyright was, okay, you get a protected period in order that your invention, let's say it's the light bulb, you get to earn back what you've got in that. But after that particular time, the idea goes into the commons. And why is that good? Because then everyone can kind of work on it and say, oh, I've got an idea for a better light bulb. So that restricted copyright is there simply for not just for the enriching of the individual, but for the enriching of all of us when things get returned to the commons. And this is what the pirates do. This is what, sampling culture and hip hop culture did. It stole stuff in order to create something extraordinary. And it did it in this kind of extraordinary way of, oh my God, that's completely illegal. You're kind of stealing music. But then people began to think, well, hold on a minute, actually this return of these great tunes to the commons allows them to enrich a new kind of cultural moment. And very, very much for me, that is central to everything in the gospel. It's certainly central to, a lot of the arguments within Corinthians about that sharing of gifts, about that idea of the common life, about us as the body and all having to kind of work together in that. That is not a privatized space. And sometimes we need people like Jesus, this heretic, thief, whatever, to come and shake that up again and say, hold on a minute, your ideas of property and wealth and power and religious narrative are not functioning well. And you can read that all the way through the Old Testament too. And they need shaking up and they need shaking down. There needs to be an idea of redistribution, which is very Jubilee, which is very kind of, what we're aiming towards in terms of that move from the garden to the city, this place that we live together in a kind of sense of interdependence.
Absolutely. All right, I'm going to make a quick bold statement about TJ and myself. Give everybody some research homework and then touch on AI. The bold statement is, if you guys are paying any attention, I have been constantly on the attack of the idea of that personal savior model that people talk about. So I would say it might be appropriate to say that TJ and I are doing an act of piracy, trying to take that away and bring salvation back to where it's more about becoming one with the whole church. So there we are. I just called us pirates because I wanted to. But on a more serious note, do research into some of the patents on different type of engines for vehicles. The reason we have gas vehicles is literally just because no one has pirated some of this technology. And also look into some of the patents on different cures for anything. The medical system is just completely awry because of what we have allowed to be privatized.
Yes.
So, with that sad research homework I want you guys to do, I did want to touch on AI briefly, because there are a couple connection points between these two ideas that you write about, because I know more recently you've been writing a lot more about AI. A lot of companies are using AI, and you mentioned this earlier, to kind of, it's like they're kind of pirating the styles of artists or the works of real artists to capitalize off of it. So it's almost like a reverse piracy, where like they're taking stuff that was owned by the artist and then trying to, well, this is now for everyone because you can just use this to copy their work. How do you make sense of some of that? And do you think the church should be addressing any of these kind of issues?
Well, I honestly think AI is one of the most important theological issues of our times. I mean that completely seriously. And one of the things that I'm incredibly passionate about is that if we only use our theological thinking to think about stuff to do with church and the religious life, we're really, really not in touch. What we understand about theology, as in speaking about large systems and the ways in which they interplay with us as communities of people and families and individuals, we need to understand that we learn stuff in theology that can be applied in terms of the other large systems that we're a part of, whether that's economics or politics or, the biggest system of them all at the moment, which has the biggest impact is the kind of huge system of technology, which we worship it. We give it huge worth. We spend enormous amounts of time, dedicated to it. So yeah, we could say that we worship that technology, and that is a very complicated thing because it is offering profoundly religious narratives. It uses profoundly religious language, talking about things up in the cloud and how, from the very early pioneers of AI, they talked about it as a technology of salvation, of one that's going to make us godlike, which is why I chose the title of the recent book, Godlike: A 500-Year History of AI. And that was a quote, by the way, from the UK government's head of AI safety, who wrote for one of the main publications over here, the Financial Times. We must pause the race towards godlike AI. And the reason I wrote the book is like, hold on a moment. What the hell do you mean by godlike? That has to be an interesting line of inquiry, which is what I wrote the book. And I was kind of looking at the ways in which technology has tried to be that godlike presence in our lives since forever, actually. So yeah, this idea of theft of language, and of course language being this profoundly deep and important element of our humanity. And if you want to go back to like the Promethean gift, stealing fire from the gods and giving us technology and language and everything, it's almost like the technology had come and said, well, yeah, we're just kind of stealing it back. Like, we are literally going to take all of your human creativity and wrap that into an enclosed space and yet sell it back to you as if it was the commons. So it's this kind of weird double thing of like, They've stolen from the commons, enclosed it into these large language models, and are then going to ask us to pay $20 a month to be able to get that back. That is so kind of profoundly double pirate that it is almost impossible to kind of work out how we should be responding to that. But my argument in the book is that we need to have really serious theological discussions around this technology rather than be fooled into thinking, hey, this will be fun, even though it has the potential to destroy everyone's work and jobs.
Yeah, I think there's got to be a line somewhere. And for me, and maybe this is where I need to read your book, but it's so difficult to figure out where it should be. Even getting away from some of the pirate language, just kind of going bare bones. What is this thing? Looking at it in my own life. Yeah. AI helping me write description of a podcast. Man, that's super helpful because a lot of times I'm just kind of Googling things and putting whatever down so that there's something in the description because I don't care to do it. But then there's modes where I'm like, I've seen recently one church, I don't want to say the name of the church, a Lutheran church I knew of, was it let AI write the whole service down of what it was going to be because it just kind of wanted to test it. And I'm like, I don't know, something about that. It's like, in a weird way, even though I'm the guy that's like, oh, church is all about communal, something about stealing that individualized part of it away still feels wrong. Like I'm like, it feels like you're taking the human out of it.
And, we have to understand this is an incredible act of human creativity. And it is an act of human creativity. The creation of AI is something we have longed for very deep down for many, many hundreds, you could say thousands of years. It's like the culmination of the human project is to build this artificial, all-knowing, godlike thing, as it were. And that presents really profound challenges because it can make us extraordinarily lazy. It can profoundly de-skill us. And it can also open us up to kind of extraordinary moments of hallucination, and that it can lead to great untruth and all the rest of it. And we've got to be really, really careful about that and guard against that. And one of the things I say to people is that the main ways that we can guard against that is to start gathering into communities of people of that mid-range size. So it's not that kind of individual. It's not the kind of mass up here. It's like that mid-level structure. And that's what has really been evacuated in the last 50 years by different technologies, whether that's technology of television. And you look at Robert Putnam's book, which I do in the book, Bowling Alone, where he kind of plots the erosion of communal activity through the kind of birth of different technologies, but particularly the television that kind of like, there's more people ten-pin bowling in the US than ever before, but fewer people than ever bowling in bowling leagues. And similarly, you see the same things with church attendance, with trades union attendance, with all these kind of mid-level structures where you have to kind of give a bit and go along and commit and all the rest of it. But those are where we learn about one another, about the other, and we learn about understanding empathy, but also what truth is in terms of experience in real life. And we begin to be able to test things out amongst one another in real life. So I think the kind of reinvigoration of those structures is going to be really important as we enter this kind of extraordinary period of our interaction with AI.
So not necessarily individualized worship or corporate worship, more of that smaller community kind of thing. I guess my question still, though, is like, I'm going to word it real simple. Should the church be scared of AI? Like, should it be one of those, like, we don't touch this? Or should it be just simply rethinking how we use it?
It can't be scared of it. If we go running scared of it, that'll be completely retrograde. And, we should be never afraid of interacting with technologies. We just need to become more reflective users of technology. As soon as you start running away from technologies and sort of demonize them, actually, you don't solve anything in that way at all. If you think about where you've used AI today, I mean, if you've been on Spotify, if you've used Google Maps, or you've used your sat nav, or anything, taken a photograph, these algorithmic technologies are already there and they are embedded in our lives and they do wonderful things. They They remove from us a lot of dull, dangerous, and dirty work. And that's brilliant. We shouldn't be saying, oh, we need to go backwards. What we should be saying is, okay, this is not about the machines becoming better and us just kind of sitting back. This is about our relationship to our machine use has to become more healthy. And my God, we got that so wrong with social media and the rise of the smartphone. We're only really beginning to understand that now, that we cannot go down that road again. Similarly with other industrial revolutions, the ways in which those industrial changes impacted different groups of people, we can't risk that happening again. If you look at the industrial revolution in the UK, where tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people were hurt and abused and broken by this kind of movement into factories and the kind of atomization of that. And it takes decades really for systems to react, for trades unions to form, for governments to say, whoa, hold on a minute. Maybe 7-year-olds shouldn't be working in factories. That, maybe we should do something about education. Like, we've got to act more quickly. And that requires everybody. It requires people within churches not to say, oh, this is a terrible thing, but hey, there are some great things here. But let's work about who we are ourselves. All technologies ask us deep questions. And AI is going to ask us some incredibly deep questions. One of the things I'm passionate about is helping people to understand how our technology use works. So, for example, and this is to simplify a lot of kind of philosophy of technology, but, when you pick up a hammer, it is amplifying what you can do as a human. And all technologies do this. A hammer allows me to put nails into a wall, which I personally cannot do with my thumb, although some of your listeners may be able to do that. It allows me to amplify that use, but it does something else. It reaches back through the arm into the heart and asks a question. What do you want to do with this extra power? You can go and smash in a window, or you can build something beautiful. And all technologies have this amplification, but also this act of questioning. And the more powerful technology, the greater that amplification, but the greater that questioning. And if you've seen the film Oppenheimer, you will see that extraordinary amplification of the nuclear bomb demands incredibly profound questioning about what we're going to do. And in fact, the story I tell in the book is that one of the characters is in that Oppenheimer film, the guy called Vannevar Bush, sees that first nuclear explosion, the test thing that we see in the film, because he is head of all research during World War II in the US of A. And he says, we've got to do better than this. And he writes an article for Atlantic magazine in 1945 saying, we need technologies of peace. And he outlines there a theoretical machine called a Memex, which will help us to become more empathetic. And that is the beginning of the development of AI. Like, we plot the line literally from that moment of shock at this extraordinary, powerful technology. So read the book about, how technology impacts us, but we must not be scared of it. We must be wary, and we must allow that kind of sense of what power is this giving me, but what questions is it asking me, and gather together to kind of answer those things properly together.
Yeah. Oh, I really like that. I will be checking that book out next. I got to be honest. I took a long time reading the Mutiny, not because it was a really easy read, but just the nerd in me. Every time I came across a story, I was like, well, now I got to research that story. So just, I took the break. So I will, I'll be picking AI up next. So that's Godlike, a 500-year history of AI, right?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then we talked about Mutiny, how pirates can save us. I think there's more to the name than that, but
something like that.
Yeah. Just look up Mutiny and Kester Brewin. It comes up. And then what was the other one? You mentioned Commons was the third one you mentioned?
Yeah. Other is an early book about our relationship to one another. Yeah. Which you can find on all good bookstores and the online ones. And there's a few books out there, but the one before, or the one in between Mutiny and the AI book is called Getting High. which is a complex title when you're a high school teacher, as I was at the time. But it's really it builds on the mutiny stuff and also leads into the AI stuff. And it's a history of our human fascination with flight and why it is that up there is somehow seen as venerated as, so it tells the story of our human quest for flight through the twin stories of the Apollo space missions and also the kind of counterculture of the 60s and says, well, there's actually some very deep questions here about two technologies again that opened up radical new powers, but asked radical new questions. And those came up with some quite complex answers for us as a species. Yeah.
Yeah. Space exploration in general really challenged how we read the Bible, because heavens means a whole new thing.
Yeah, it certainly does. Yeah.
Oh, man. Good stuff. So did you have a preference of where people can get your books, or do you just, wherever they find it's fine?
Wherever they find it's fine. Just go find them. Yeah. I mean, I'm always for the local bookstores. And if you kind of dig around my local bookstore in London, that's the only place you can get a signed copy of the AI book, if that's particularly a thing. But obviously for people in the, on the other side of the pond, you might want to go to an online retailer or get someone to order it into your local bookstore. So
I wish I would have thought about that a couple of weeks ago. My wife was actually in London. I could have had to pay for it.
Yeah.
Man, I missed out. But fantastic. I won't miss out next time. I'm sure I'll be back there eventually. Thank you so much for joining me, man. As we wrap up, one thing we do like to ask every guest is just if you had to give a tangible, a practical action for those listening that would help better engender unity in the church today, what's something practical you think people could do?
I would simply say something that is empathetic, which is when you look into the eyes of someone you disagree with, what do you see reflected back within yourself? So it's how we see ourselves in the eyes of the other, I think, can be a really profound experience of helping us to become more united.
And as people begin asking that kind of question, what do you think will change in them and in the world around us?
We need humanizing experiences. So much of the algorithms that moderate our interactions with one another are written in order to kind of promote disunity, because that's what sells. And in fact, we can go beyond that, and we can do a lot better if we empathize with one another and look beyond the kind of the angry algorithm. Yeah,
for sure. All right. So very last thing before I say my final words, we have a God moment segment here. We just like to share something that God has done with us recently, or in us, or just a moment we've seen God in, challenge, blessing, whatever. Again, these are all like TJ segments, so I'm struggling here. But he likes to make me go first, and mine's pretty easy. TJ actually drove 3 hours to watch Deadpool and Wolverine with me the other day. And it wasn't a particularly spiritual film, but there's just something about knowing you have friends that are willing to travel to see you and getting to spend time with one another. When we don't get to spend as much time together these days as we used to. And my wife came out too. She doesn't like the theater, but just having us three together and just getting time with one another was particularly meaningful to me. So that'll be my moment. Did you have any moments you'd like to share?
So I'm very lucky. I've just driven back from the French Alps, where I spent a week up in the mountains with a whole bunch of families and kids and stuff. There's something really just wonderful about being in high places, and something profound about the beauty of those sort of landscapes and of being together in those places. So that was a wonderful, wonderful experience of and a kind of thin place, I suppose you'd call it. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, good stuff. Well, with that, I'm going to struggle through TJ's part. I did want to mention, because I should have mentioned this earlier, I suppose, but we missed last week's episode. Our guest had a family emergency came up, so we just weren't able to record. So I apologize to anybody who wanted to know what happened this whole episode and just now got to hear an hour in. Sorry. But that's what happened. And we will be back. This is our last regular episode before we get into our next series. So if you enjoyed this one, share it with a friend, an enemy, or a cousin. Again, you could Always support our show by subscribing to our Captivate, Apple Podcast, or Patreon. So that always helps us out if you want to help the show, put a little money our way, and you usually get a bonus question or two in there a month. Just depends on what we have time with recordings. You might notice longer recordings we don't always do the bonus questions for. But again, check out the other shows on the Amazon Ministry Podcast Network. I mentioned them earlier. Check them out. They're cool. You can find a link in the show description below. Again, we hope you enjoyed it. Next week, we're going to have a week off. We're going to have 1 week off. And then we're going to have an intro to our What's Next series. We're going to kind of tell you guys what's next and after is all about. Then we're going to be moving forward. We will be doing an episode with Father Jonathan and maybe Professor Chris Moreland about what's next after salvation through confirmation or conversion at our churches. What's next after you go through some of that stuff. And finally, at the end of season 1, Francis Chan might be on, but he doesn't know it. So someone's got to tell him. That's the bit. We got to say it. You guys got to make it happen because we're not going to. All right. Thank you guys so much for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Whole Church Podcast. Again, you could always sponsor our show at patreon.com/The Whole Church Podcast or on captivate.fm or on Apple Podcasts. You can also leave us a one-time tip through Captivate. Thank you for listening.